Now we are going to study the creative writing as a research method, and this is written by John Cook, University of East Anglia. So this article we'll be reading because it is a part of our research methods, and it's a part of our syllabus also. So let's start. Let's begin. Before that, please subscribe the channel Dr. Anju Gurawa. The idea of creating creativity or creative writing as a research method may seem a contradiction in terms. Long held beliefs about the nature of creativity identify it as something that is outside or beyond methodical thoughts. Plato presents his philosopher Socrates as a charmed by poet, but skeptical about the letter's capacity to be governed by reason, because we all know that Plato was very much suspicious about the capability of poets, and that's why he never wanted that poets should. He actually mentioned that in his Republic, chapter 10, that poets must be banned from the community and society because they impact the philosophy, learning, and the education of the society, and they make people more imaginary, which is not good for any society. So that's how I repeat again. What is that? A capacity to be governed by reason. A poet is a light and a winged thing and holy, and never able to compose until he has become inspired and is beside himself, and reason is no longer in him. So Plato says that there is no reason in the poet's thinking because they are not logical and they are not reasoning. Romanticism is often taken to reinforce this belief in its count of poet as the exemplary creative individual. Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads. Actually, but later on we come to know that Aristotle, जिनको कि हम हिंदी में बोलते हैं, he actually reversed the idea, and Aristotle says that poets are most creative and they are setting the order of the society. And in this continuity we know about Wordsworth, and that is what the lyrical ballads. We all know about lyrical ballads, and this is all about poetry. Is the source of one influential idea about the psychological and emotional process that goes into the making of a poem. Poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. This definition, I guess, we all remember as we completed our graduation in English, and we all know that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. This is the definition given by Wordsworth. Whatever else may go into the process of composition, according to Wordsworth, recollection and contemplation amongst them. The emphasis given to spontaneity here might seem at odds with the systematic labor and careful preparation associated with method. Another famous romantic statement, this time from Keats. So we know Keats, Wordsworth, they are the most famous romantic poets. Reinforce the idea that creativity and methods are to acts. If poetry comes into as naturally as leaves upon a tree, it had better not come at all. A poem, according to this view, occurs as if by natural necessity. The poet may be the medium through which the natural necessity work, but no amount of method will be either help or hinder the process. So this is what the definition of Keats is there. One way of summarizing this durable and still active constellation of belief is to say that an important dimension of creativity lies in its engagement with the unconscious processes. The creative writer has some special relation with these processes. However, defined as this relation is what makes the writer valuable. And all this happens beyond or outside established canons of reason, and since the idea of method is an integral part of the development and the display of reason, method is at least irrelevant and at worst threatening to creativity. So that's how our main focus is creative writing. This is what the topic creative writing in research methodology. And there is another and opposite assumption about creativity that makes it difficult to reconcile with the idea of method. In this case, creativity is assumed to be particularly intense or prolonged kind of labor. Creative work is something like a vocation or religious calling. The person engaged in it is set part of others, utterly absorbed by the demand of particular work, oblivious to everyday division of time between work and leisure, getting and spending. Yeats, in one stanza of his poem, The Long Legged Fly, present Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel in Rome in just one term. The artist's imagination is trance like a state of utter absorption. So Michelangelo, we all know he was a great poet of Renaissance, and what Yeats is talking about him, and that's what we come to know. Okay, Yeats, what does he say about Michelangelo? Right. Okay, so what Yeats is talking about Michelangelo's the work. Okay, like a long leg fly upon the stream, his mind moves upon silence. So this is what the creativity of the mind of a poet is there, and this is with the reference of Michelangelo by Yeats. Right. Yeats presents the moment by moment action of the painter. His hands moves to and fro, and the mental state that accompanies them. Out of this state, according to Yeats, come the work that shapes how we imagine ourselves. But it is hard to see how this version of artistic work can be reconciled with the idea of method for last two reasons. First, what happened in the moment of artistic creation cannot be generalized as a point of rules or predecessors of the kind that we associate with the idea of method. Second, a method implies an economy. It is a way of working that will achieve results in a given period of time. But Yeats' presentation of Michelangelo suggests that he is oblivious to time in its sense. Another example would be novelist James Joyce. And we all know, the artist James Joyce, as a young man, who took 7 years to write Ulysses, and another 20 to write Finnegan's Wake. If he were working in today's research environment, he would not get marked for time management. These assumptions about creativity recall see trends to method continue to some extent to be prevalent, even as an increasing number of universities and colleges are awarding PhD for creative work. The English Subject Center 2002 report on postgraduate training and research method, Williams 2003, identified a skill set of research method in English. These include higher order analytic, critical and literary skills, domain knowledge, bibliographical knowledge and so on. Understandably, the new reflect assumption that a doctorate in English would be work of criticism and scholarship. Creative writing as that document was acknowledged did not fit. In a section on MA degree and their function in the providing research training, the document state creative writing was seen to be an exception and to be unlike other master's degree. This is followed by quotations from one of the respondents in survey that provide the basis of support. In creative writing, the skill are being able to workshop a piece of writing and learn from peer responses, being able to feed this back into creative process. The practice of production original research means that research and analysis may be presented differently from other aspects of English. 2002-14. The last sentence is tantalizingly vague. How in practice is the difference expressed? Unfortunately, nothing more is said. The purpose of document that at this point was simply acknowledge an exception. The stress that creative writing puts upon established definitions of research was also evident in another text from the English Subject Center, Creative Writing, a Good Practice Guide, Section 9 of the guide, Research and Research Training, acknowledged the extension of doctoral level work in creative writing and affirmed its value as a form of research. But there were clearly problems of alignment. The different actors of the research process did not work with the same script. In 2001, research assessment exercise allow for a form of research based upon the invention and generations of ideas, images, performances, and artifacts, including design, where these led to new and substantially improved insight. But some universities chose not to return the work of lectures in creative writing in 2001 research assessment exercise RAE. Perhaps because it was felt to be too risky, given again the tantalizingly vague nature of the definition of creative research. What would be example of new or substantially improved insight? Nothing is said in response to the question, either in RAE documentation or in subject center guide. When it comment on research training in creative writing, the subjects creates guide drew heavily on another report, research training in the creative and performing art and design. Research training in creative and performing art and design, published in 2001 UK Council and Graduate Education. This report took as its starting point the model of research proposed by then Art and Humanities Research Board. Research questions need to be identified, a research context defined, and appropriate research methods specified. This model is juxtaposed with a statement about practice-based research, where practice is defined as exercise of appropriate skill in the creation of an original work in the field or fields of creative and performing art and design, drama, dance, music, fine art, graphics, fiction, poetry, design. The report is wisely reticent when it comes to the question of research methods in practice-based research. Acknowledging the plurality of the art in addresses, the report author suggests that an eclectic approach could be valuable and reject any attempt to agree a generic curriculum of research methods which would be applied across the field. The difficulty of assimilating practice-based research in creative arts to establish method of research in the humanities surface in the response to questionnaire that formed the writing of the report. Two contradictory claims interpret the same absence in different ways. One asserts that the distinctively creative nature of CPAD, creative and performing art and design, research is often at odds with formal training programs. The other asserts that the traditional methods are lacking in many CPAD disciplines. The first claim celebrates what the second claim seems to lament. In both cases, the traditional tension between the idea of creative and idea of method is evident. The Platonic image of the poet lived on, if only an hesitant flicker of the resistance to requirements of the Research Council. Given these difficulties, it is no surprise that the report identifies the need for a continuing evolution of research method in the art through national debate. Indeed, since then, English Subject Center has engaged in much wider discussions around creative practices as a research. Nonetheless, the need for engagement with research method in the art remains processing. Even as the Art and Humanities Research Council seem to have moved from methods to skill and training in its pursuit of prevailing employability agenda. The argument that follows about the practice of writing as a research method is intended as a small contribution to this debate, as well as the guide to writers who may be about to start or have already started doctorate in creative and critical writing. The report cited in this introduction make a valuable prelude to the debate about research method in creative arts without actually getting the argument started. They are attempts to reconcile the different demands of research council, academics, writers and artists and students engaged in doctoral level work based in a creative practice. The moment-based bullet point decisiveness and acknowledgement of plurality of methods and individual procedures indicates how difficult it is to address these varied and often conflicting constituencies. How might the practice of writing be identified as a research method? The question seems to contain a paradox. Writing is usually regarded not as a research method but as means of presenting the result of research. The quality of writing can of course affect the quality of presentation, an issue reflected in the English Subject Center's account for the skill needed for the doctoral work. These included how to marshal an argument, how to think critically, how to write clearly and cogently. What this implies is that the writing presents something, an argument, a line of critical thinking, the identity of which has been determined as a part and act of writing itself. The rhetorical order of the sentence itself suggests a progression from the marshalling to thinking and then to writing. We might assume that something similar hold true for creative writing. Imagination gets to work as the character in novel comes to mind. Then more than one character or story structure is mapped out or poetic image and then process of writing set down that the imagination has conceived. I suspect this conception of writing is more a product of rhetorical habit than serious intellectual conviction. It would be readily conceded that writing is integral and not just secondary to marshalling an argument, thinking creatively, creating a character, a story, a scene, or an image. But what then might it mean to think about writing in this way? One answer to this question and one way of giving a substance to the notion of writing as a research method depends upon the idea that writing is means of discovery. This in turn assumes that the kind of discovery made are connected to the development of technique. To conceive of writing as discovery or technique implies the necessity of rewriting, and it is also calls for the practice of writing informed by extensive reading. If these conditions are met, then I think it is appropriate to call writing as research methods. The idea that writing is a form of discovery can be interpreted in a number of difficult ways. In this way, feeling into words, seemus hine. Okay, so this is seemus hine makes the distinction. Craft and technique. Craft is what you can learn from others. In case of poetry, it may have to do with learning certain meter and verse form. Well-crafted poetry can be an exhibition of technical virtuosity, but not. In Hine's sense of technique, technique is a moment in the evolution of work and perhaps of the writer. So let's save it. Okay, learning the craft is learning to turn the windlass at the well of poetry. Usually, you begin by dropping the buckets halfway down the shaft and winding up a taking of air. You are miming the real thing until one day the chain draws unexpectedly tight and you have dripped into water that will continue to entice you back. You will have broken the skin on the pool of yourself. Hine as metaphor for writing combines a sense of familiar and routine with the moment that is strange and unexpected. Routines of writing can produce unexpected outcomes. They can move from known to unknown, a moment Hine describes late in the same essay as discovery of the ways to go out. Normal, cognitive, bound and ready inarticulate. Hine's argument is that craft is transformed into technique in a moment of discovery. What is discovered has at least two aspects, both conditioned by his belief and that romantic conception of the writer still constitute a living tradition. Writing teaches back into experience and forward into form. Both constitute kind of discovery. Poems begin with something given. In Hine's formulation, the first stirring of the mind around a word or an image of a memory, and end with something made. The two process of discovery of a hitherto discloses dimensions of experience in one case, of the adaptation or invention of a form in other, are connected to a self-realization. Craft, according to Hine, can be developed without a reference to the feeling or self, but technique cannot. The discoveries initiated by technique can be summarized in a metaphor that often finds its way into discussion of writing, that of finding a voice. What is meant by voice here is at once individual, a voice different from other voices because what can be heard in it is, in Hine's words, your essential pattern of perception and comprehensible, saying something that is worth listening to because timely and needed. Voices is discovered in the encounter between literacy tradition and non-literacy speech. Finding a voice in this sense is not a once and for all matter. If it is the goal of what technique can discover, the voices itself has to be reinvented under the pressure of changing individual and collective experience. Heine derives this account of writing a discovery from reflection of his own development as a writer. Writing nearly 30 years before Heine, an American critic, Scorer, Heine and Mark Scorer, gave a different inflection to the relation between writing technique and discovery. His essays, Technique as Discovery, is concerned with the development of critical concept. One that will distinguish between novelists who regard technique as a means of presenting subject matter and those the writer scorer approves of whose techniques discovers their subject. A novel technique is something more than the application of a set of literary skill. The manipulations of point of view, the ordering of event in story, the invention of dialogue and character that can be learned and applied to a given subject. Instead, technique in fiction is a deep and primary operation. It is, according to Scorer, the only means by the writer has discovering, exploring, developing his subject, of conveying its meaning, and finally of evaluating it. Scorer's essay is an attempt to find a critical vocabulary that will be adequate to technical innovations of modernist fiction. I repeat, Scorer's essay in an attempt to find a critical vocabulary that will be adequate to the technical innovations of modernist fiction. His exemplary novelists are writers such as Joyce, Conrad James. One value of Scorer's essay is that it can be translated from its initial context and purpose and used to build a concept of writing as a research method. Like Heine, Scorer want to make a division between the two ideas of technique and that correspond to, but not expressed by, Heine's distinction between craft and technique. The limited conception of the technique gives a priority to contempt over form. It insists that the value of novel lies in the relevance or scope of its subject matter. The manner of its presentation is secondary. For Scorer, that distinction cannot be drawn in either the serious practice or the serious criticism of the novel. Subject matter is discovered through technique. The initial idea of prompting for a novel are transformed into subject matter by the application of technique. Scorer may not make clear whether his idea of technique can be thought of something that takes place in mind of the writer, independent of the practice of writing, but the implications of this essay is that technique is inseparable from the act of writing. At one point in this essay, he argues that the resources of languages are part of technique of fiction. Language that is thought of something to be work or even work ever. Language that counters of an ordinary speech is forced through conscious manipulations into those longer meanings which are ordinary speech almost never intend. Writing as technique discovers these larger meanings in language, bringing the force of an artistic will be here on a kind of speech that is ignorant of its own possibilities. Scorer is attracted to the idea that properly creative writer, one capable of using techniques as a mode of discovery, is a manipulator. In the art of fiction, language is not the only source subject to manipulation. Point of view is, according to Scorer, another crucial technique. Like language, it can be developed in a way that discovers significance in a subject, or it can be deployed as an inter-device. So there are two things Scorer is talking about, that language itself is a technique and then point of view. These two things we need to understand. Okay, so this language and the point of view. Language itself is a source, and the point of view, how it is being presented. The criteria that might distinguish between these different views can seem elusive. Scholars argue that discovering techniques does two connected things to the subject of novel. One is objectification and other by way of objectification. So objectification and then objectification is evolution. Objectification identifies a process in the respect of the writer. This entangling of unconscious emotional attachments and fantasies invest in the subject matter of the novel. The consequences of this is this tangling is the achievement of an objectivity appropriated to literary art. For Scorer, the creation of significant literary fiction is an ethical act, and objectivity he has in mind is an ethical objectivity. But the examples he uses make clear ethical objectivity does not mean the affirmation of one set of value over another. The technique as discovery is both process and process, a testing of the limit of particular perspectives and values, and on the part of the writer, a repeated questioning of the significance of a given subject. Scorer writes out of strong conviction about the importance of the novel as a modern literary form. The value of technique is related to what it can discover about a particular cultural epoch. The technique, now here we are going for the technique. So the technique of the technique of modern fiction at one greedy and fastidious achieves as its subject matter not some singleness, some topic or thesis, but the whole of the modern consciousness. It discovers the complexity of the modern spirit, the difficulty of personal morality and facts of evil, all the intractable elements under the surface which technique of the surface alone cannot approach. The second lofty and quite possible vacuous ambitions of the writer, especially in the face of understandable skepticism about a totality such as the whole of the modern consciousness, but the value of Scorer's analysis of technique as a discovery does not depend upon acceptance of these ambitious claims. The relevance of these sentences come from their work. The technique achieves its subject matter, discovers complexity. The novel is not described as representation or expression. Techniques are not in service of mimetic credibility or the requirements of genre. The techniques that Scorer describes are not manifestations of underlying structure, rule, or effects of language. Technique in Scorer's sense is emphatically the work of the writer, not a set of a rule be applied, but a potential to be developed. What writers do when they write, it's differently described by Heine and Scorer. Heine writes as a poet who believes in the credibility of lyrical voice. Now, remember these two writers, Heine and Scorer. Heine writes as a poet who believes in the credibility of the lyrical voice. Scorer writes as a critic of novel. Both have their version of technique in writing as a form of discovery. In Heine's case, the discovery is hidden, depth and form adequate to depth. Scorer's case, it is potential of the subject once it is explored by technique. Both assume that writing that is strongly creative will bring what is experienced as a outside or beyond language into language. In Heine's formulation, technique enables the poet to read the inarticulate. Now, this paragraph is really very significant, and you need to understand it very carefully and read it again. And what is that? I read it again. You know, both these scholars, what they are talking about the creative writing and how they are giving their differences. So, what writers do when they write is differently described by Heine and Scorer. For example, you are a writer and you want to write a poem. So, when you are writing a poem, what would be different? As a creative writer, Heine writes as a poet who believes in a credibility of lyrical voice. So, if you believe in the technique of Heine, then you would be focusing on the lyrical voice. Scorer writes as a critic of novel. Both have their versions of technique in writing as a form of discovery. In Heine's case, the discovery is of hidden depth and form. So, according to Heine, it would be your hidden depth and form. How do you form? Form is a technique and depth. In Scorer's case, it is potential of subject once it is explored by technique. Both assume that writing that is strongly creative will bring what is experienced as outside or beyond language into language. In Heine's formulation, technique enables the poet to read the inarticulate. These formulations raise questions about purpose and progressiveness that are themselves connected to the idea of method. To have a method implies that you know what you are about. That your work will not be undermined by the accident. aggression or irrelevance. To possess the method of assume a kind of reassurance about the future, even an insurance against it. Method promises results and it promises them in good time. The 17th century philosopher Descartes is often taken as an example of methodical analysis. In his meditations, he formulated a research method, doubt everything, and research goal, the discovery of absolute certain creativity. So you remember, when we start our research, we have certain questions, hypothetical questions, and that's how we formulate our question, and then we start on the basis of those hypothetical questions, we start our research. So doubt everything and research goal, the discovery of absolute certainty. That opening page of the meditations bristles with the purpose and preparation. Descartes' conclusion about the one thing he can be certain, I think therefore I am, has become a celebrated philosophical slogan. That's what the very significant. I think therefore I am has become the celebrated philosophical slogan, something that can be solemnly questioned or affectionately parodied. But Descartes' example is instructive and in another way. His selection of a method allows him to embark confidently, but it is not long before he finds himself in trouble. It feels as if I have unexpectedly fallen into a deep whirlpool which tumbles me around so that I can neither stand nor the bottom nor swim at the top. The narrative of the meditations become an allegory of method. It exhibits a tension within the idea of method itself between its imperative and its exploratory character. A method implies a set of rule and procedure, a dictation to thought or imagination as to how either is to be proceeded, but it is also implies an exploration to be undertaken, something that may produce a discovered what is unexpected. A method may prove itself insufficient in the face of what is discovers. My argument is so far about research method may seem to be exclusive about method's exploratory character. The imperative requirement of method, do this and this will result, seem to be only weakly met. I want to exacerbate this problem by considering a third example writing as discovery from Dennis Riley. As recent book, The Word of Slaves. Riley is both as a poet and theorist. The Words of Slave Selves combines a version of the autobiographical questioning of practice that characterizes Hines' feeling into words and version of the analytic stance found in Scora's technique as discovery. But the tone of her argument and its direction are radically different from both. She questioned the idea that creative writing leads to the discovery of voice and offers only a qualified support for an idea of technique as manipulation. Riley's construction of the process of writing does not begin with an experience that awaits articulation. Language is there from the start, a kind of din in the head, coming not from one within the self but outside it. Voices coming from the outside make the attempt to find a voice into an exotic search. Poetry in its composing is an inrush of others' voice, and in this respect it is no more than licensed intensifications of the very same property in prose. So finding one's own voice must always be a frustrated research, fishing around in a strange fry-up and boulier by a sea, in which half-forgotten spike or slimy thing doubled up to the surface. Word crowding uninvited, regardless of sense, flocking not through the brain but through the ear. Creativity, a term that Riley dislikes, is vested in the working of language, not in the originating itself of the writer. Language endlessly interfaces with itself. The same sound produces words and sentences with very different meanings. A phrase taken an unexpected meaning because it contains an unrecognized quotation. Voice is made up from the echo of other voices. Riley isn't much interested in the writer's passivity as this is of her activity. The idea that creative writing emerges is a masterful technique is displayed by the different idea. The writer who listened to a language, Heidegger account of the poets provide 1% here. Both the responding in which a man authentically listens to the appeal of language is that which speaks in the element of poetry. The more poetic a poet is, the freer that is, more open and ready for the unforeseen. He is saying, the greater is purity within him. He submits what he says to an even more painstaking listening. Okay, so we have covered up to the 209, like the 209 page, and